Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and thank you to the Parr Center for inviting me here today, and for everybody else for showing up. I realize that the pizza's not actually in the room, so you could have taken it and absconded away, but you came in, so thank you. That did not go unnoticed. Several years ago, I left my job in public defense to work in public policy. I thought that if I could change the laws that were so profoundly affecting my clients, I could be a better advocate. So I took a job at that nonprofit in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my focus was on criminal records. We held these criminal records clinics in the basement of a government center in a small windowless room. In this space, men, women, and youth, all poor, predominantly people of color, would line up for hours waiting for the opportunity to speak with an attorney, hoping that they might get a chance at a second chance in the form of an expungement. I'm sure the sun had long since set one day when in walked our last participant. Anthony was tall, thin, black, and clearly distraught. As he wended his way across the room toward my table, I wondered what was wrong, right? What would cause this man so much worry? And as he sat down across the table from me, he pulled from his back pocket a copy of his criminal record, a printout he had received from a terminal 2 flights up. I opened it nervously. What could this rap sheet contain? Perhaps you can imagine my surprise when I found that it was no more than a theft, and a minor one at that. I let out a laugh. I said, even if the court doesn't expunge this, it's not like your life is over. And with that, Anthony began to cry. He told me that, in fact, earlier that day, he had tried to take his own life. You see, what was just a theft to me, to Anthony, was a lost job. It was missed housing payments. It was skipped meals. It was door after door slammed in his face. It was the loss of respect from his friends and family, the loss of a sense of self, the loss of hope. Around this same time, I had been driving across the state of Minnesota, speaking to legislators and landlords, employers and licensing boards, and imploring them to give my clients a second chance. Time and again, I would hear, you can't trust a con. Once a criminal, always a criminal. Those words came back to me as I looked at Anthony. And I thought, how many times had I taken something that wasn't mine? What had I had the luxury to forget? What would life have been like if I had been caught and burdened with a criminal record? 1 in 4 people in the United States has a criminal record. I contend that 4 in 4 have a criminal history. For the past few years, I've been traveling across the United States asking people like me, the 75% of people in the US who have criminal histories but no record, what have you had the luxury to forget? Today, I would like to share with you some of those stories. Some are quite egregious, others relatively innocuous. Some happened decades ago, others a bit more recently. In doing so, I hope to offer a new way of examining the deep and disparate impact of our criminal and juvenile justice systems upon poor people, people of color, and indigenous people across the United States. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. This is a graph taken with data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it shows the US state and federal prison population between 1925 and 2013. On the far end here, you have 1925 at fewer than 200,000 people in cages, and at 2013, more than 1.5 million. Now, barring for some general population growth, you can see that the sheer number of people that we put behind bars was relatively steady until something happened in the 1970s, picked up speed in the 1980s, and exploded in the 1990s. What are some of the policies and practices that may have led to or contributed to this mass incarceration disaster? Shout it out. War on drugs, huge, right? Arguably one of the greatest contributing factors. What else? Private prisons, the commodification of pain, without doubt. What else? Mandatory minimum sentencing, yes. What else?
Greater prosecutorial decision-making.
Yeah, yep. So sentencing guidelines and greater power given to prosecutors. Absolutely. There's also the war on mental illness and poverty, 3 strikes rules, which is very similar to some of those issues, and concentrated policing in minority communities that have led to this. Now, notably, this mass incarceration, mass disaster is not only unprecedented in our own history, it's unparalleled in the world. The United States contains about 5% of the world's population and nearly 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We have become the world's warden. Now, what's additionally concerning is what happens to people once they're no longer locked up, once they are back in the community and trying to get on with life. That's when people find that a new punishment begins, when you may no longer be locked up, but are now locked out of opportunities for jobs and education, licensure, and life. Now, before we delve into the world of collateral consequences or those issues that lead to perpetual punishment, let's first examine this graph a little bit more closely. As I said, this is the US state and federal prison population between 1925 and 2013. But just as importantly is what this does not show. For example, this does not show the millions of people who are in county and parish jails. It doesn't show people who are on mental health holds, on immigration holds, or in juvenile detention. It doesn't show those who are on probation or parole, their liberties curtailed under the thumb of the criminal justice system, but not spending their nights behind bars. And it doesn't show the estimated 65 to 100 million people like Anthony who have a criminal record. So people who are suffering under the stigma of having that interaction with the criminal justice system stamped upon their histories. Just as importantly, this doesn't show the nearly 3 million sons and daughters, the countless brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, spouses and partners, and greater family and community members who can all be profoundly impacted when someone is taken out of the home and then not allowed back in. They are not shown here on this graph. So what may appear to be a tsunami of humanity ready to crash upon our shores, you realize is just a drop in the overall greater ocean of a crisis. Now that crisis is not, that crisis comes at no small cost. The United States spends nearly $80 billion a year locking people up and keeping them under control. And that cost is not borne equally across the United States. It doesn't include what communities spend to house, train, educate, counsel, treat, employ, and otherwise transition individuals who are leaving prison or jail. And that is a burden that falls disproportionately upon people of color and poor people. For example, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for Black men in the United States is 1 in 3. 1 in 3. For white women, such as myself, it's 1 in 111. Now, that is not to say that white women aren't committing crimes, but it's not who you see, proportionately speaking, in our jails and prisons. Importantly, note that the rates of offending do not come close to explaining these disparities. Looking at just the war on drugs, for example, arguably, again, one of the greatest contributing factors to our current carceral crisis, white individuals and Black individuals use and sell drugs at roughly the same rates, and yet Black people are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, charged prosecuted and punished for engaging in drug activity than are whites. Poor people are likewise disproportionately affected. For example, every year in the United States, there are more than 12 million arrests. 80% of those arrested qualify for public defense. Understand that in order to qualify for free defense, you must be staggeringly poor. Now, in addition to people of color and poor people, our system also disparately affects those with mental health or chemical dependency concerns and those who are intellectually disabled. And yet, we do nothing to help people once they're in the system. In fact, we do a lot to exacerbate those very problems. Prison is warehousing with trauma. With too few exceptions, meaningful opportunities for education and treatment, they're non-existent. Saddled with criminal records, people leave custody with fewer chances to move on and move up. In other words, people enter the system already deeply disadvantaged and then are spat out even more so. Understand that disparities start early. For example, Black youth as young as 5 are suspended and their actions criminalized at far higher rates than their white classmates for engaging, by the way, in the same behavior. And while some of the highest crime rates come from affluent teens, that's not who you see in our juvenile justice system. Understand that kids these days are growing up in the data age, and a scarlet letter stamped upon the ether cannot be scrubbed clean. Now, leaving the kids behind and returning to the adult world for just a second, according to the National Employment Law Project, 1 in 4 people in the US has a criminal record. According to the Bureau of Justice statistics, that number may be closer to 1 in 3. And those waters just keep rising. They affect us in countless ways. For example, employment. Somewhere between 87 and 92% of employers conduct criminal history checks on job applicants. Many result in automatic disqualifications regardless of the recency of the offense, the relevance of the offense, the severity of the offense, or the accuracy of the record itself. Housing can be next to impossible to obtain if one has a publicly accessible criminal record. Licensure, be it practicing law or emptying a bedpan, can be impossible with a criminal record. Government benefits. So if we have cut out all other legal opportunities to put food in your belly or a roof over your head, we've also eliminated that. Education. Let's pause on this one for just a second. The Common Application Form, the form that is used by some 600 colleges and universities nationwide to determine the makeup of next year's new admissions. It asks the question, have you ever been convicted or adjudicated delinquent of an offense? Yes or no? Can you imagine your ability to access education limited to a checked box? Yes or no? And while you may say that that question is just one variable in a larger algorithm determining the character of an applicant, make no mistake the chilling effect that that has on somebody with a criminal record. Because unlike, say, employment here, you have to pay to be denied. $20, $50, $70 a shot just to be told that you're a criminal and we don't want you. This at a time, by the way, when there's no research showing that prior criminal activity in juvenile years has any bearing on future campus safety, and at a time when countless research shows that the ability to access education can be one of the greatest determining factors in a reduced recidivism rate. We should be pushing people into school at a time when we're locking them out. The ability to, immigration is affected. Both the ability to stay in the United States and petition family to join can be affected by the presence of a criminal record. Travel can be affected. When I was working at the Council on Crime and Justice, we had this woman come in. She had been a member of the Red Hat Society. Is anybody familiar with the Red Hat Society? How would you define the Red Hat Society? Are you the one that said yes? How would you define the Red Hat Society?
Women over 50 who decide that they are going to travel and enjoy themselves, and their colors are purple and red, and they wear the hats, and they just have a fabulous time.
Absolutely. So I believe they're women over 55, but 50 may be the case. It's a social club. It's a sisterhood, right? Where women don their red hats, and purple jackets, and they travel together. And they volunteer together. They have lunches and brunches together. They go to the theater together. They have book clubs and debates together. And every now and then they charter a bus and go to Canada together. Or at least that's what this particular sisterhood, this particular chapter was doing. They got up to the border and patrol said, I'm going to need to run everyone's background check. So the women all dutifully handed over their licenses, thinking nothing of it. Sometime later, patrol came back on the bus and walked through the aisle, handing back the licenses. Go ahead, you're fine. No worries, you can go. There you go. You shall not pass, he said. You see, what had happened was 3 decades ago, this woman was accused of a crime. Now, she was never arrested, much less convicted, but that accusation, that arrest record, she was never charged, much less convicted, but that arrest record was enough to bar her entry into the country. Her sisterhood said, see you later, and they dropped her off at a gas station in International Falls, Minnesota. It's right on the border. Did I mention she's in a mobility chair? So here she is in her red hat and purple jacket in her mobility chair at a payphone, calling back home to have money wired up so she could return. But she said that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was as that bus was pulling out of the station, one of her sisters put down a window and said, I thought I knew who you were. As if what had allegedly occurred more than 30 years ago was the full sum of this woman's character. Not those lunches, not those brunches, not those book clubs, not those debates, not the hours of volunteering in the theater, not even the 4.5 hours it took to take that bus up to the border. None of that mattered. She was suddenly reduced to a single moment in time. And as preposterous as that sounds, think of how often we do just that. How we think we know who someone is because of what their record says. Civic participation can also be affected by the presence of a criminal record, the ability to cast a ballot, to participate in your democracy. So it's nearly every aspect of who we are and how we are in this world, from psychological to social, from personal to professional. We are confined and defined by our criminal histories, but not for everyone. In fact, just for a few of us, right? Just for 1 in 4 of us. For the other 75%, people like me, we've never had to answer. We've never had to, I guess, relay things that we've done. So several years ago, I decided to ask that question. What have you had the luxury to forget? With the understanding that we're all criminals. I drew up a flyer. I sent it out through our social service network at the nonprofit. But I asked our network not to respond because I didn't want to hear from people that I already knew. Instead, I asked them to forward it on to their coffee clubs, their religious organizations, their college campuses. And I left my contact information on the flyer, fully expecting not to hear from anybody. To my surprise, the phone started to ring. So I bought a camera and a recorder. I hopped in my hatchback and I drove all across the state of Minnesota and now all across the United States, interviewing people in parks and in cars, in diners and on boats. That's definitely in Minnesota. Anywhere where somebody might feel comfortable enough to disclose to me something that they've otherwise had the luxury to forget. You can find the first 80 or so of those stories on the website at weareallcriminals.org. If you go on here, you'll see that when you click on a pic, you'll see how the person how the person is introduced in the world, as an attorney, as a professor, as a police officer, as a policymaker. What follows is how they would be introduced had they been caught. Sale of controlled substances, theft, assault. Click twice and you go into the story itself. Some are quite serious, like this student's aggravated robbery, or this pastor's experience bringing a loaded gun on an international flight. Some are relatively innocuous, like this gentleman who had an open bottle that was carrying a beer from one house party to the next, or petty theft, failure to return a library book that is an offense, by the way. Next one down was public urination. This gentleman now has a contract to work with the Department of Defense, some of the highest security clearance in the nation. Had he been caught, he would find difficulty getting a job at even entry-level positions. I know because many of my clients were denied those very jobs at industries throughout the United States for these very records. You'll also find that the responses to the recollections of past transgressions are varied. Like this gentleman who, when he was recalling the time that he had taken his uncle's hunting rifle out to college with him, and one night deciding to liberate the quarters within a double-posted parking meter by taking one drunken shot right through the locking mechanism, letting loose $40 worth of quarters. He now calls it his $40 shot. And he laughed throughout the entire interview. Some people note that they have not just the luxury to forget, but the luxury to not regret. And while others are deeply sorry. This woman told me about a time when she was working as a barista. She said she used to pad her tips with bills from the till. $1 here, $5 there, $20 every now and then. As she told me this, the tears streamed down her face. She said, "I can't imagine what life would be like now had I been labeled a thief then." Time and again, I heard from people who recognize that crime is not, that crime is an event in a life course, not a static characteristic of one's being. Although not everyone has had their story ready. This woman was actually one of my favorite interviews. Although, by the way, I still am interviewing, so if you would like to be my next new favorite, please do contact me. The reason I liked this woman so much was because she didn't have a particular story in mind, but she did have a curiosity, a humility, and an openness. She said, "I am in my 20s. I recently graduated from college. What do you think I've had the luxury to forget? Help me remember," she said. Shout it out. What do you think? What do you think she's gotten away with?
Drugs.
Drugs, absolutely. Prostitution, is that what somebody else said? She did not, although that is quite common with students. What else? Alcohol, right? Do you mean underage? Is that what it's saying? Underage drinking? Absolutely. How did she get that alcohol? Fake ID. She said, "It's my sister's." Does that count? Yeah, that counts. Absolutely, that counts. What else? She was quite proud that DWI was not among those. She did hit 3 of the publics, though. What are some of the publics that you can think of? Public urination, that's one. Public intoxication, that's the other one. Public indecency, that's the third. Someone's been on college campuses. There was one that she told me about that I thought was really interesting, not because of what she committed, was theft. That's very common, but because of how she described it. She said that she and her friends would leave house parties, and on their way back to the dorms, they would stop by this campus pizza by the slice place where there were 3 employees, right? So employee number 1 would take your order, employee number 2 would take your money, and employee number 3 would give you your pizza. She said that they would just skip employee number 2. So they would give their order, they would take their pizza, but they wouldn't give their money. She said, technically it's not stealing since it was my pizza. We had a long talk about technicalities. She said, okay, fine, but really, is any of this stuff something that people get caught for? And I told her about a client of mine who had been caught stealing a sandwich from a Lund's buffet, from a grocery buffet some time ago. He was underemployed at the time. After getting caught and charged with a petty theft, a very minuscule theft, he promptly lost his job, fell behind on rental payments, and is now living out of his car. Does that happen for everyone? Would it happen to me if I got caught stealing something today? Not that I have any intention to do so. Honestly, probably not. I have a very tight social safety network upon which I can fall. Not everybody has that. In fact, some people are hanging on by a single thread, and a publicly accessible criminal record can be the thing that cuts it. I've heard from peace officers who reflect upon the weight of the mistakes that they've made, and I've heard some truly heartbreaking stories, like the story of the gentleman for whom I took this photograph. You can read the entire story online, but I'll give you the abbreviated version right now. When he was 15 years old, his family moved to a rougher neighborhood than they had been in before, and the neighborhood before was rough enough. He said that within the first few weeks, he found himself being mugged and beaten several times. But after a while, he noticed that when he hung around a certain group of guys, the beating stopped. So he did what perhaps any logical 15-year-old would do, and he joined the gang. Now, that didn't come for free, and the price was exacted one Saturday morning, when he was told that if he didn't pick up the lead pipe and beat another child, a 15-year-old from a rival gang, that he himself would be beaten. He said he made the choice that day that he's regretted ever since. In fact, now, decades later, he says not a month can pass by where he doesn't at least once wake up in the middle of the night screaming, thinking that it's all happening again. He picked up that pipe and he hit that child. The body was dragged away. Had he been caught, he would have been charged with, at the very least, first-degree assault for the benefit of the gang. He would have been certified to stand trial as an adult, where he would have been convicted. Once convicted, he would have entered prison, eventually been released, and likely entered again, and been released and entered that cycle that happens to so many people across the United States. He was not caught. He graduated from high school. He got a scholarship to go to college, where he said that for the first time he was able to complete a math problem. He could read an entire paragraph. He was safe. He wasn't constantly checking over his shoulder to see what was coming next. His grades skyrocketed. He went on to graduate school and now has a PhD in biophysics. Am I saying that that would be impossible had he been caught? No. But it would have been highly unlikely. Let's break it down. Had he been caught, he would have been incarcerated and likely would not have received that scholarship, right, to go to school. If he could have somehow found money or been granted a loan in order to go to school, even after checking all of those boxes, he would still find difficulty getting onto campus because he would have to check that box, showing that he was not just a criminal, but a violent felon. Once on campus, once in his program, the ability to gain access to internships, housing, employment, countless life opportunities like dating or existing in the virtual world would have all been foreclosed to him had he been introduced into the world by his criminal record. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be consequences, right? But when we are constructing these consequences, they must be rational. They must be reasonable. They must be merciful. And perhaps above all else, they must have an end. Because without hope, what does one have? Time and again, I heard from people who said that they engaged in drug activity, like this gentleman who donated some of his FAFSA funds to help finance a drug ring on campus. Or this woman who said that she sold weed to frat bros and football players so that she could get a "hey, what's up" in the hallway. She said she was sick of feeling invisible. I'll actually skip this one. I'll tell you just briefly that, actually, you know what, I can't even abbreviate it without breaking down and crying because this one is so ridiculous. But I will jump to the end and tell you that I had a client who was 72 years old, a woman, an Ojibwe woman, who in her late 70s was convicted of possessing her dead son's drugs and is now living on the street. So we can talk about the cost and we can talk about the hidden cost, but this is the human cost. This project seeks to remind all of us, while we have done something that we may not be proud of, and some of us quite a few things that we are proud of, some of us, perhaps 1 in 4 of us, may be in need of a second chance. But make no mistake, this project is also a commentary on the disparate impact of our policies and policing and prosecution upon poor people and people of color. Many of the participants have benefited from belonging to a class and race that is not overrepresented in our criminal justice system. And some people have been pretty straight up about that. I grew up in a very affluent town, he said. It was the kind of place where it was easy not to have contact with police. The few interactions I had were very respectful and innocuous. A tap on the shoulder, a suggestion to go home. Understand that not everyone is afforded that same assumption of innocence. For some, in particular, Black men and youth in America, their mere existence is seen as always, already criminal. And while you're thinking about the stories of people who have gotten away with it, consider the lives, the narratives of people serving time right now, of people who are carrying the burden of a criminal record for that same activity right now, of people who never made it home. There are millions to choose from, even if you're looking at just those in prison. And tens of millions of more stories of those who were never incarcerated, but nevertheless who have been defined by their criminal story, by their criminal records. Even for those with more serious offenses, consider how being criminalized at a young age foreclosed countless opportunities to get out of that pipeline to prison. Keep in mind, as Bryan Stevenson says, that each of us is worth more than our worst moments, than our mistakes, than our public mugshots, than our private memories. More than 4 decades of mass incarceration and mass criminalization have numbed us to that. It's drained our budgets, it's drained our communities, it has put the vitality and the vibrancy of this nation in peril. I don't think that policy change alone is going to solve this. We need to question the very assumptions that our system rests upon. We need to invest rather than incarcerate. Our criminal justice system is teeming with scholars and students, with artists and counselors and caretakers and leaders, change makers, fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. Consider the next generation. Think about what you can do here today to change their lives, to change this narrative, because no child should have a prison bed waiting for them. Here's what I hope. Bless you. I also hope that. In addition to blessing you, I hope that you see a bit of yourself in this project. I hope that in that reflection you take note of the context that you've allowed yourself and acknowledge that not everyone has had, acknowledge that some others may have had that same context but were caught, right? I was young. I was drunk. I was in a bad relationship. I gave it back anyway. It wasn't my idea. No one got hurt. Whatever that context may be, make sure you take note. I hope that some recognize the privilege you've experienced and appreciate that not everyone has benefited from that same privilege. I hope that you reflect upon how very patently different your own life may have been had you been caught, and consider the foreclosed futures of all of those who have been. Finally, I hope that this project inspires you to take action. The lovely Ms. Mia Walker is here to talk to you about what some of that action may be. One more sec. I'll wrap up in a second. But be prepared to ask Mia all the questions about how you can get involved and hear about some of the truly exceptional things that are happening in this state right now. Consider this, and I'm going to read it for the people in the back. Can't see it. It says, if the criminal justice system was designed by people who believe they might one day be involved, then we would have justice. Because this isn't going to happen on its own. I'd argue that the first step is challenging the narrative that has dominated our conversations and our concepts of criminality, namely the clean versus criminal, the us versus them. So I'll ask you today to consider this. What's your story? What would your chalkboard say? What have you had the luxury to forget? How would life be different if a Google search on you didn't find a carefully curated Instagram page or Facebook account, but instead your mugshot? What would life be like for you here? And what would your future hold? We Are All Criminals is a call for mercy and compassion and reason and equity, and acknowledged ownership in the problem as well as the solution, so that soon, when Anthony, that's him there, opens that sheet of paper, the page that's used to define his character, he finds not thief, but father, caregiver, nurse, speaker of multiple languages, survivor of genocide, avid reader and volunteer coach. A man not defined by his worst moment, but by his true worth, with the luxury to forget and the opportunity to be forgiven. A man not tethered to his past, but wholly able to live in the present and to dream of a future. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me. Good. Can we give Emily another round of applause? So just a little brief introduction about myself. I am the engagement coordinator for the North Carolina Justice Center's Second Chance Initiative. We work exclusively with men and women who have been directly impacted by incarceration. Our platform is primarily advocacy and policy, but I have the pleasure of working with my brothers and sisters directly. And so part of my job is to host listening sessions through our estate to not only be able to provide resources and help to reduce the collateral consequences, but also to give them a safe space where they get to share their stories. I always believe that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so really wanting to turn the power back to them to create advocates for justice. Now, I'm a big person on language, so you're never going to hear me say criminal, convict, felon ex-felon, ex-offender. We want to use language that actually promotes that individual. So we say directly impacted, or we say justice involved. You can say formerly incarcerated, but never use language that constantly reminds people of who they are or their worst act. We are a state and we are a country that is very punitive in nature and that constantly wants to remind you that this is something that may have happened 10 years ago, but this is who you are. And we're always going to rub that in your face. So I want to just share a few stats about North Carolina. We have 1.6 million in our state that have criminal records, 40,000 individuals that are in our state's 70 prisons. I had no idea we had 70 prisons in our state. 95% of these individuals will eventually leave prison. It costs North Carolina Department of Public Safety $30,000 a year per individual. So times that, the 40,000, you know what our budget is, right? So we have a Justice Reinvestment Act that was just instituted a couple of years ago, and that is partnering with the Bureau Institute of Justice and other organizations to provide justice reform. However, we have not designated the prisons or where that funding is going into. So right now we're in the process of that, but even though we have money, even though we're wanting to see reform, even though we want to really change the system, it's still very punitive. It's still very hard. It's very difficult. Some of the stats are saying that 43% people that receive an education will reduce recidivism by 43%. However, people who have a drug felony or people who just have a criminal record, it finds it very difficult for them to be able to get an education. And they have to go through so many hoops in order for that person to see them apart for the crime. So, and the other thing that I want to talk about is that we have now become the world's leader in incarceration. Our numbers have literally jumped from 2.2 a couple of years ago to now 2.4. We're also the world's leader in incarcerating women, which is extremely saddened because now women are following similarly the crimes in the footsteps of our brothers, and we're incarcerating and criminalizing people who have mental health issues. So that population is blowing up. The sad thing about that, and a consequence of any man or woman who have children, is that 70% of our children will follow in their parents' footsteps. So whether it's the school to prison pipeline, or it is the person that's actually becoming depressed, or whatever has impacted them as a result of their parents' incarceration, they're following in the footsteps. We are one of 2 states, New York and ourselves, North Carolina, that still have not raised the age. We're in legislation, we're in talks. My team, we've been working with various lawyers across our state, but it still hasn't changed. Yes.
For the age legislation,
Yes.
I've been led to believe that this legislative session is like a session that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But has that changed after the unexpected results of the election?
We actually, part of our team has worked on creating that, and Administrative Justice for Law had a commission report that came out in 2016, and they talked all about like the implications and mental health issues and why this is important, and just being able to put them in a facility where they can receive rehabilitation and be able to connect with their family and loved ones. It just hasn't reached that process yet. And so for this legislative process and session, we're hoping that it will change. I'm really hoping that it changes. It's the same thing with New York. They're in the same state. Also, they are trying to close Rikers. How many of you are familiar with the Khalif Browder case? Okay. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old in New York, and him and his friend were pulled over because of a backpack, and they said that Khalif had stolen the backpack. It was the person that accused him was Latino, and said that he stole his backpack, and they told Khalif, who was an Afro-American kid, told him that if you just come and talk to us, everything will just go away. And so in his mind, he's thinking, I'm going to tell the truth and you're going to let me out. 3 years later is when he was released. And the reason why is because we target poor communities of color. The bond at the time was $10,000, and then if this family paid the bond, it was $32.85. They couldn't pay it. And so he was locked in prison with adults. He was assaulted, he was sexually assaulted, he was beaten on occasions, and it just really devastated him. One day he gets this call and says, okay, you're released. And so he was released. He found it very difficult, though, to handle life after being in such a destructive situation that constantly oppressed this little kid. He was very frail. You can Google him. You can look at his body. He's very tiny and having to endure. And he felt like the only way that I'm going to survive is just to fight my way out. I want to say a year after he was released, his mom heard this noise in her house. It was like a thud, like a really loud thud. And she went into the room and she saw that he had an air conditioning unit in his window and it was kicked out. And he had literally crawled to the other side and took the cord and wrapped it around his neck. And he hung himself. That case stays with me all the time. I cry about it. I get upset about it because this is a kid that shouldn't have died. This is a kid that shouldn't have even been in prison. Oh, and by the way, the person that accused him fled to Mexico. The judicial process and judicial system and the district attorney, this kept going back and forth, but they kept him there in a hostile environment, which Rikers is hostile in itself, not just for kids, but adults. It's a fight to the death situation. That's our system. And so that's one of the efforts that we are trying to, in terms of working with our juvenile population, is try to raise the age. If you look at your legislative agenda to hand out, our goal for this season is really to change the game. So on April 25th, we're hosting Lobby Day. It's going to be in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to meet at Edenton Street United Methodist Church. We're looking at a lot of legislators and approximately 200 people are going to be in the room. We're going to talk about like what our platform is and the things that we want to convey and we want to communicate to the legislator. And then at 11:30, we're going to walk and actually share stories. I love in what Emily has done and talked about all the different stories because narratives have power. And so for anything to change, we want to be able to get in front of the legislator, the people that are making the policy, the people that are or supposed to be reforming our justice system to say, this is wrong and it needs to change. And so we want to talk about raise the age. We want to talk about the Justice Reinvestment Act and having our local reentry councils expanded. Fair consideration of criminal records by employers and landlords. I can't begin to tell you how difficult it is for men and women to find a job. So in Wake County, we passed Ban the Box. And I will admit, I'm not familiar with what Orange County has done or anybody outside of Durham and Wake. But I will tell you is that we have passed Ban the Box. And how many of you are familiar with Ban the Box? Okay. Ban the Box is when you can go and apply for a job and it says, have you ever been convicted of a crime in the last 7 years? Of course, you're going to say no, and you just keep it moving and you get the job. For someone who has a criminal record, that is their stopping point. Because even though they haven't been convicted of a crime in the last 7 years, you still have to check the box. Because if you don't, and then I look at it, then I'm like, okay, well, you lied. So you're a liar. So it just really prohibits people because most people, there's this fear of you're a criminal and I don't want to risk the liability of hiring you. You have the opportunity, if it's removed from the application, at least I can come in and redefine the narrative not based off what society says, but what I've done, all the changes that I've done in my life. We want to expand opportunities for legal relief, including expulsion and certificates of relief. So we have two options of relief in our state. Certificate of relief. These are if you have lower level crimes, not A, B, or C, but if you have like H, I on the lower level, we want to expand the opportunities for those to be dismissed or to be categorized up so that when you go to an employer, you can actually show that. And then the employer, it actually takes the liability off them. And expungement obviously is just really great because it expunges your records like it's never happened. However, many men and women in our state and across the country have more than one felony. And that's what the state does. That's what our system does. It's like, oh, well, you may have stolen something, but then we're going to put that there was a battery charge and that you did X, Y, and Z. And so we attach all of that and it's no longer separate, it's multiple charges. So the last thing I want to leave you with is, and Emily touched on this with her whole entire presentation, is one of my favorite authors is Bryan Stevenson. How many of you know him? You have to know him. Okay. He is the author of Just Mercy. He is the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. And one of his things that he talks about in terms of his presentations is wealth, not culpability, predicts outcomes. And that is absolutely true. I'll also throw race in there, and he does as well. But Two cases that come to mind when I think of that. The first was a couple of years ago when I heard about the affluenza case. How many of you remember that? There's only a couple of you that know affluenza? Okay, so Google Ethan Couch. Ethan Couch had these very extremely liberal, wealthy parents who they gave him a house to live in all by himself, and he would have parties and he would drink and his friends would come over and he would, he was 12. He would drive a car to school and just, the school principal was like, you're not allowed to do that. Oh no, it's Ethan. He's good. He's a good kid. So one night he has a party in his house by himself on this massive property, by the way. He has a party, he has his friends over, they're drinking a lot of alcohol. His parents, by the way, provide the alcohol. So, it's okay, right? Because he's a kid and we're kind of supervising, we trust him, right? He has this alcohol, he's drinking. He runs out of alcohol, so he tells his friends, hey, let's get in the car and let's go get some more alcohol. And they look at him, they're like, no, you're drunk, we've been drinking. No, it's okay. And he gets in his Ford pickup and he runs over 4 people on the way. And you literally see him go, I'm not sure if he was at Walmart, but it was on the way back when the accident happened. Now, the issue with that is that some therapists, who I hope license has been revoked, said that this was an affluenza case, that because he had so much privilege in his life and that he was left to his own devices, that he didn't know any better, so therefore he should not receive punishment. And the judge was like, you're right, he shouldn't be incarcerated because maybe that is something that's legit. So let's just give him 10 years probation. And they did. Of course, he violated because, he was crazy and he decided that he was going to drink again, and they put it on Facebook and then the police caught him. And then he fled to Mexico because, that's what you do when you have money, you could just flee. And then he was brought back, and I'm not sure where it stands right now, but he has 10 years probation, which can literally turn into 10 years of prison because he violated. Now, should he get that? Does he deserve that? There was no remorse. I watched the Dateline interview. There was no remorse from him. There was no remorse from his mother. There was no remorse from his dad. But that's our country. All right. And then we also had the Brock Turner case, which is very recent. Well, I'm sure you all know that, right? Yeah. Because it would be too bad of an impact for him if he goes to prison for 20 minutes of nothing. And I literally had to rewind. I was like, did he just say that? Or am I like, what? Yes, that's the kid that saw the woman passed out by the dumpster and decided he's just going to go and have sex with her because why not? So 6 months probation. Actually, he did 3 months in jail. 6 months in jail, 3 months that he actually served, and now he's on probation. Although he does have to register as a sex offender, but the point being is that his privilege, he had a speedy trial. And the judge was like, absolutely, you're right. That's our country. That's the state of our country. So when you hear people say that it targets poor people of color and it continues to not only criminalize the behavior of those, but also continue to push the families and communities into poverty, absolutely true. Those of you in the room, have an opportunity to change that. Not asking any of you to go become attorneys, but it would be really great. But I recommend that you take this as an opportunity to use your voice and say that this is wrong, that we want to see all people survive and thrive, that we want to see our criminal justice system change, that we want more programs inside our prison, that we want more opportunities for men and women to not only be able to find employment, but secure employment and to find housing, because it's a circular process. If it's housing, it's employment, it's education, it affects all areas of their life, which is why our criminal justice system, our numbers are so high, because people continue to recycle through. When your back is up against the wall, I'd rather go sell that crack rock and know that I'm going to instant $10,000 or however much it is, versus that I'm going to get $7.25 at McDonald's. It's easier for me to go this way. And you automatically think that I'm a thug anyway, so why not? Why should I not go that way? So I challenge you all to really advocate, to find compassion in your heart, to use your voice for power and change and to do good. Thank you.